Pace University of his dream of exonerating others as an attorney. Jeff previously won New Yorker of the Week, the 215th Humanitarian of the Year, and is listed in the John Jay College of Criminal Justice book 50 at 50, which features 50 alumni who embody the John Jay mission, compassion and commitment to service. He spent 16 years in prison from the age of 17 to 32 for a murder and rape in Peekskill in Westchester County, losing the trial in White Plains prior to exoneration through DNA testing that identified the actual perpetrator. So now I give you this comment.
In 1989, a classmate of mine was found murdered and raped. Peekskill was a small city here in Westchester County with a population of approximately 25,000 people. Murders were very rare. So when this murder happened, it understandably created an atmosphere of fear, rumor, and paranoia. Parents were concerned with their own safety as well as the safety of their children. In high school, I was quiet. I was to myself. I didn't participate in very many organized sports. This made me seem strange to the kids in the school. In the course of the police investigation, the police interviewed many students from the high school. Some of those students told the police that they might want to speak to me because I seemed strange to them. This is what the police said initially attracted them to me. The other factor which they said attracted them to me was that they said that I was overly upset at the victim having been murdered. Yet there were mental health facilities set up all throughout the city of Peekskill to help people process what had happened. Again, keeping in mind that murders were very rare. So for about 6 weeks, the police played this cat and mouse game with me, in which half the time they would speak to me as a suspect, and the other half the time they would speak to me pretending like they needed my help to solve the crime. They would say things like, "The kids won't speak freely around us, but they will around you. Let us know if you hear any rumors. Stop in from time to time." They would ask me opinion questions and then congratulate me on my opinions being correct. They made me feel important. They made me the center of attention. I came from a single-parent household in which my father was never involved in my life in any way. So that directly intersected with the police tactic of good cop, bad cop, otherwise known as Mutt and Jeff, in which one officer takes on a more aggressive role, whereas the partner pretends to be a friend who's against what's going on, but somehow powerless to intervene. With, of course, the purpose of that tactic being when the person being questioned becomes frightened, it's only natural you would look to a friendly face for support, for assistance. The other factor is that growing up, my fantasy childhood career, pre-teenage years, was I actually wanted to be a cop. So this unexpected early opportunity to do this quasi-police work, along with my age, 16, was how the police were able to pull the wool over my eyes. Eventually, they got me to take a polygraph test, otherwise known as a lie detector test. They told me that some new information had come into the police file and they would like to share that with me, and that this would put me in a better position to help them. Help us to help you to help us type of logic was employed. So the next day, rather than report to school, I instead went to the police station, where I...
Excuse me, would everybody please be sure that their telephones are turned off? I'm sorry, excuse me. Thank you.
So the next day, rather than report to school, I instead went to the police station, where I expected the polygraph test to happen because I had heard through the rumor mill that the other people had been polygraphed there. Because it was a school day, neither my mother nor my grandmother, with whom I lived, realized that anything was wrong. So therefore, they did not call around looking for me. As far as they were concerned, I was actually in school. They drove me to the town of Brewster, which is in Putnam County, about 40 minutes away, whereas I was a native of Peekskill here in Westchester County. So that meant I was no longer able to leave on my own. I was instead dependent upon the police. Now, there were 3 officers who came there with me from Peekskill, but then there was also the Putnam County Sheriff's investigator, Daniel Stevens, who was dressed as a civilian and who was pretending not to be a cop. I didn't have an attorney present, and I wasn't given anything to eat the entire time I was there. They gave me a 4-page brochure on how the polygraph worked, and it contained a lot of big words, which I didn't understand, but I just dismissed my own concern by thinking, well, I'm here to help the police. Let's just get on with it. What difference does it make? Or so I thought. They put me in a small room, and the polygraphist gave me countless cups of coffee, which seems fairly clear in hindsight that the purpose of that was to get me to be nervous. He then attached the polygraph machine to me, and he launched into his 3rd-degree tactics. He raised his voice at me. He invaded my personal space. He kept asking me the same questions over and over again. Now, I wasn't used to interacting with or talking to adult males, and so the way he was carrying himself made it really frightening for me. He kept that up for 6.5 to 7 hours.
Were you?
I was 16. Towards the end of the interrogation, he said to me, "What do you mean you didn't do it? You just told me through the polygraph test results that you did. We just want you to verbally confirm it." So when he said that to me, that really shot my fear through the roof. At that point, who should make his grand appearance other than the officer who had been pretending to be my friend? He came in the room and told me that the other officers were going to harm me, that he had been holding them off but could not do so any longer. "You have to help yourself here. You understand?" Well, considering that I'd maintained my innocence for that 6.5 to 7 hours, it was fairly clear what he meant by that. They wanted me to confess. When it was added that if I did as they wanted, that not only would they stop what they were doing, but that I could go home afterwards, that I was not going to be arrested, being young, naive, frightened, 16 years old, not thinking about the long-term implications, instead just being concerned with my own safety in the moment. I was in fear of my life. The fact that I didn't know where I was and that nobody else knew where I was either loomed quite large in my mind. I was emotionally overwhelmed, and then there was the push-pull dynamic in play, because on one hand I had been threatened with harm, and on the other he had just thrown me this false life preserver. So I decided to make up a story based upon the information that they had given me that day and in the 6 weeks run up to it, as well as some items that had been in the newspaper. By the end of the interrogation, I collapsed onto the floor. I was called up into a fetal position. I was crying uncontrollably. Needless to say, I was arrested. I was charged with a murder and rape. Now, before I went to trial, the results of a DNA test came in from the FBI lab, showing that semen found in the victim didn't match. But rather than acknowledge they made a mistake, the prosecutor continued full speed ahead. In order to explain away the DNA test result, the prosecutor got the medical examiner to commit fraud. When an autopsy is done, there's written and audio notes which are supposed to be taken contemporaneously as the findings are made. So it was only 6 months after doing that autopsy, hundreds of autopsies later, and only because the DNA suddenly didn't match me, that suddenly the Westchester County medical examiner at the time, Dr. Lewis Rowe, he suddenly remembered that he had failed to document before the medical evidence that he had shown, in which he claimed demonstrated that the 15-year-old victim, who had been in the country for about 1.5 years, leading a really sheltered life, where she never went outside unless she was accompanied by her older sister or her parents, that he found medical evidence showing that she had been sleeping around. So in order to wrongfully convict me, they were willing to trash her reputation. Taking it a step further, the prosecutor named another youth by name that he claimed had this encounter with the victim. But he never had a DNA test performed on this other individual to prove that. He never even called him as a witness. He just made the unsupported argument to the jury. At the same time, the public defender that I had from the Legal Aid Society of Westchester essentially didn't defend me. He did not interview or call as a witness my alibi. I was actually playing wiffle ball when the crime happened. He never explained to the jury the significance of the DNA not matching me. He never used that to argue that this so-called confession was coerced and false. He very rarely met with me. Whenever I met with him and tried to explain to him what happened in the interrogation room, he was always shutting me up. At one point, he told me he didn't care if I was guilty or innocent. When it was time to discredit this medical examiner on cross-examination, which obviously would have been very important, he stood up in open court with a big smile on his face, as if he knew the medical examiner and they were friends for a long time. He said to him, "You're going to be pleased to know that I don't have a single question for you." My lawyer should have never represented me from the beginning because of a conflict of interest in that this other youth that the prosecution was falsely claiming had slept with the victim was represented not only by another member of Legal Aid Society, but also specifically by the lawyer who was supposed to be supervising him on my case. That conflict of interest prevented the defense from subpoenaing him, from the defense from asking him for a DNA sample in order to explode the myth of consensual sex, to make the DNA test result stand up. My interrogation was not videotaped. It was not audio taped. It was no signed confession. It was just the officer's word. And as a result of that, they were able to leave the threat and the false promise out of their story. So I wanted to testify at the pre-trial hearing where the judge was supposed to determine the admissibility of the confession, and whether my rights had been read to me and whether I made a voluntary waiver of them. So I wanted to testify as to the threat and the false promise, but my lawyer wouldn't allow me to. He told me that he hadn't decided if I was going to testify at the trial or not, and therefore he didn't want to have me on the record under oath saying that the prosecutor could use the prior testimony to cross-examine me with at the trial and try to make it appear as if I was lying, even if I wasn't. So he didn't allow me to testify. But then when I got to the trial, he wouldn't allow me to testify there either. He told me that it wasn't his job to prove that I was innocent.
What was his job?
Yeah, what was his job?
He said it was up to the prosecutor to prove that I was guilty, not for him to prove that I was innocent, which is a legal principle, but that's a very naive way to practice law. In reality, you have to try to prove that your client is innocent, or you run a risk of your client possibly being wrongfully convicted. Add it all up, I guess it wasn't too surprising that the jury found me guilty. I'll never forget the day I was found guilty. I felt like I was in some sort of nightmarish alternative reality, because to my way of thinking, at least up until that point in time, only guilty people were convicted. Yet the jury said what they did, and I was taken into custody. On the day of the sentencing, I begged the judge to overturn the verdict because I was innocent, and I referenced the DNA to support my contention. He actually told me on the record, "Maybe you are innocent," conceding that there was a doubt. I mean, how couldn't there be a doubt? The DNA didn't match me, and all they had was this confession obtained under highly questionable circumstances. That didn't lead him, though, to step up for justice and exercise his discretion to overturn the conviction, which he could have done by reversing any number of rulings that he had made against me in the course of the trial. Instead, he took the easy, politically expedient way out, which was to sentence me to a term of imprisonment of 15 to life.
16 years.
I want to share with you a little bit about my prison experience. I was sent to a men's maximum security prison, not a facility for youth, because I had been charged as an adult. I was 16 when I was arrested. I had turned 17 by the time the trial rolled around, and I lost. The guards themselves were obstacles. To be sure, some were professional and did their job, but others brought their problems from their home life into the facility, displacing their aggression onto the prisoners. Then there were other guards that they just wanted to do their 8 hours and they didn't care what happened while they were there. And that might sound like an ideal attitude that you'd want an officer to have if you had to be incarcerated, but it didn't actually work out like that in real life, because it would not be unusual for them to sometimes look the other way and walk in the opposite direction when violence was occurring. so as to be able to avoid breaking things up and having to file paperwork afterwards. Then some of them, even their peers, didn't like them because the manner in which they conducted themselves made it likely that prisoner-to-staff violence could occur and that could suck them in and make a big situation. But nobody ever bothered to reel them in, not their coworkers nor the people who supposedly were there to supervise them. There was the facility in which I spent 13 and a half of the 16 years, Elmira. It was particularly violent there. There were 3 or 4 stabbings or cuttings every day. There was no shortage of violence that did not involve weapons, and there was plenty of gang activity. Taken cumulatively, there was a general atmosphere of violence and adrenaline that was always present because at the drop of a dime, something could happen. There was a system of maintaining order in the prison known as keep lock, which involved a variety of sanctions being imposed on the prisoners if they were found guilty of having broken a prison rule. Those included, but were not limited to, being kept in the cell 23 hours a day out of the 24. They would send you less food. Sometimes the food would be 3 or 4 days old. You could take 2 showers one week and 3 the next, rather than being able to shower daily as the rest of the population. Their idea of complying with the court-mandated 1 hour a day recreation consisted of putting the prisoners in a small caged area by yourself with maybe a pull-up bar in it if you were lucky. You could not use the phone while you were on that status. There were several times in the course of my incarceration that I was assaulted, one time in which I nearly lost my life. I got hit multiple times on the sides of my head with a 10-pound weight plate because the prisoners thought that I was a rapist, and there's a vigilante mentality towards people convicted of sex offenses. While I was in prison, I tried to minimize the loss that I was experiencing. I got the GED, I completed the associates, and I completed another year towards the bachelor's, but then even that silver lining was taken from me. In 1995, George Pataki became governor of New York, and he decided to cut the funding of college education for prisoners. When that happened, I started participating in the vocational shops, but although I amassed a lot of certificates, they really weren't worth the paper they were written on because virtually all the curriculum was obsolete years before I ever stepped foot into the vocational shop, and most of the instructors were not really there to instruct anyway. They were really just there for a paycheck and to do the minimal amount that they could do. I remember that the food was terrible. Sometimes it would be burned, and other times it wouldn't be fully cooked. I remember that the infamous Sunday dinner, put that in quotes, was a piece of bologna, 2 pieces of cheese, an old hot dog roll, a small bag of chips that was mostly air, a bowl of soup that had all the ingredients that already had made 4 or 5 appearances that week in other incarnations. Nobody touched that. A fork and a slice of a peach. So that was dinner. So there was portion control problems is what I'm trying to get at. Towards the end of the sentence minimum, the correctional authorities told me if I wanted to have any chance at all of making parole, I would have to take and complete the sex offender training program, which the problem with completing that program was the manner in which that was administered had a guilt admission requirement tied to it. Everybody in the shop would be expected to admit guilt verbally to the instructor and to the other prisoners. A verbal rendition wouldn't cut it. They wanted it all to be in writing with all the details. Failure to complete any aspect of that would result in an immediate removal from the class, with the prisoner being deemed to have refused to complete the program. I guess it was a similar theory to AA, where you have to admit you have a problem before anything can happen. But I kept explaining my innocence. I showed the legal paperwork about my DNA, and I said, look, I don't want to make a problem in the class. I just want to get through this program, get the certificate, so when I go to the parole board, I can try to get out of here. But they wouldn't hear of that. I would have to do all the guilt admissions that everyone else would. And so in the end, I decided not to take the program. When I went to the parole board, I knew they were in the habit of rubber stamp denying applications from anyone who'd been convicted of a violent offense, regardless if they could show that they were rehabilitated and if released, they would not pose a threat to society. So I tried to protect myself by raising the issue of my innocence and citing the DNA. They were not willing to consider even the possibility that I was innocent. not even as a contextual issue for then evaluating the rest of my application. And they really weren't that happy with the fact that I didn't take and complete the sex offender training program either. And I couldn't express remorse and take responsibility, which is what they wanted to happen anyway. And so I was turned down for parole. I'd like to share with you a little bit about how I was exonerated. While all of this stuff in the prison was happening, and more than that, I was simultaneously appealing my conviction. I naively thought that the court system got better the higher up that you went. I appealed my case to the appellate division, where my issues were my innocence, that the verdict was against the weight of the evidence, that there wasn't legally sufficient evidence, and that the prosecutor hadn't proven guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. I don't think any of you need a law degree to know that all those arguments are meritorious, and that my Fifth Amendment rights had been violated by the way in which I had been questioned. And there were 6 other issues of law that I'm not going to get into. The appellate division ruled that there was overwhelming evidence of guilt. So I don't get that ruling even now. I mean, the DNA was in my behalf. They ruled that I was not in custody, that I was free to come and go as I wanted, and therefore the statements were voluntary. And then they dismissed my other 6 issues of law with 1 sentence, writing that they had examined the rest of my contentions and found them either to be without merit or not preserved for review. They ruled against me 5-0. And as bad as that decision was, that was the most any court ever would write. My lawyer filed a re-argument motion, but that was denied in 1 word. The New York Court of Appeals declined to give me permission to appeal to them. I lost in federal court because the court clerk gave my lawyer the wrong information pertaining to the filing procedure. And as a result of that, my petition arrived 4 days late, which again had my innocence argument in it and my Fifth Amendment rights. I appealed that ruling to the Federal Court of Appeals. Judge Rosemary Pooler and Judge Sotomayor were the ones hearing my challenges. My lawyer argued that this was not a delay. My lawyer argued that this was not a delay caused by me and my attorney, but instead by the misinformation by the court clerk, which, again, I don't think that we need to have a law degree in order to know that's a good argument. It's a valid argument. My lawyer argued that upholding a ruling like that would be the cause of miscarriage of justice to continue, which kind of links back to the DNA and innocence argument, his back door, and that overturning the procedural ruling would open the door to more sophisticated DNA testing. But the federal court upheld the lower court ruling. My lawyer then moved to re-argue the case in front of them, requesting that all the judges on that circuit, all 9 of them, hear the case and make a ruling, rather than the normal 3-judge procedure. But the re-argument motion was denied by the same 2 judges, and the United States Supreme Court declined to give me permission to appeal to them. So that marked the end of my appeals and the end of legal representation. So that meant unless I was able to come up with some previously unknown evidence of innocence, or unless some law change that was retroactively applied, I was permanently locked out of the courthouse. That was in 2001. The path, therefore, was to try to find a lawyer who could take my case for free and an investigator, hoping that they could, in fact, find some previously unknown evidence of innocence. So I wrote countless letters. I wrote large law firms, because I had read that such firms often have a pro bono section in it. Very rarely did I hear back from any of them. The rare times I did, they told me they didn't have time to take my case, but they did make sure that I knew how much they wanted, should I have been able to scrape it together. I wrote reporters, especially those who had written on other wrongful conviction topics and cases, hoping that that would lead them to understand what a negative DNA test result was. Maybe they'd dig around a little bit, write an article or 2, and my case could come to the attention of the necessary legal help, as I had read it happen in a few other cases. Only I never heard back from any of them. I wrote churches and other faith-based organizations, reasoning that their belief in God, in whatever form or faith that might take, would cause them to be against injustice and in favor of justice, and by extension, favorably disposed towards me. Perhaps there was a parishioner that was a lawyer or investigator that they could prevail upon. Or alternatively, maybe they would raise the money for me, except that I never heard back from any of them. I wrote nonprofit organizations that do help free wrongfully convicted people, but the amount of people looking for help versus the resources, there was a big disparity. I wasn't able to beat the other cases in that cruel competition. Eventually, I wound up in touch with an investigator. I wrote a book author in care of the publishing company, and someone at the publishing company instead sent it to an investigator rather than a publisher. The investigator, who worked out of Colorado and Maine, told me that she was too far away to work on my case directly, but that she would help me network to get the direct legal help. And she worked for me for about a year. One of her ideas proved to be the winning one. She suggested I write the Innocence Project again, a nonprofit organization in Manhattan which frees wrongfully convicted prisoners across the country in those instances in which DNA testing can demonstrate innocence and in which no prior testing had been conducted. I wrote them originally in 1992-93 when they had gotten started. They had never before come across a case in which there was a negative DNA test but yet a conviction. The data bank didn't exist, and there was this prior testing, so it wasn't like they could test and then argue that this was something new. So they had declined to give me representation back then. But coming back to 2005, I would not have thought to write them again thinking I would get a similar response. But the investigator told me that with the advent of DNA data bank creation, that the prior denial was irrelevant. I caught another break because the intake worker there, Maggie Taylor, when the lawyers again did not want to go forward with my case, she represented it an additional 2 times, coming up with new DNA theories as to how it could be used. She got it across with the idea that I had suggested to her in one of my letters, the data bank. So getting the representation was the first most significant break. The next was that the former Westchester District Attorney, Janine Pirro, she had left office. She was the one who had blocked me from getting all the testing. She had, as she frequently says, she wasn't the DA when I was convicted, but she took office before my first appeal was decided, so she kept the ball rolling against me and she wouldn't allow me to have further testing. And the third thing was we got lucky. We were taking a really big chance. I'll do Q&A at the end. We got lucky because the actual perpetrator committed another crime. He killed a second victim 3.5 years later. He was a school teacher in Peekskill who had 2 kids. And he had gotten caught for that crime, which resulted in his DNA being put into the data bank. So that when I got the testing, which the new DA allowed me to have voluntarily, it matched him. And confronted with that evidence, he confessed it was him who committed the crime. On September 20th, 2006, my conviction was overturned and I was released. I reported back to court November 2nd, 2006, at which point all the charges against me were dismissed on actual innocence grounds. I received an acknowledgement of my innocence from the prosecutor and the judge, but neither of them were their counterparts who were originally involved into my wrongful conviction. I'd like to switch gears and talk a little bit about transitioning back to society. It's not easy to put your life back together again after being through a traumatic experience like that, particularly one that lasted 16 years and particularly one that was through my formative years. The culture was much different than what I knew before. All the people in my city, they had moved away, and although I recognized some of the buildings and structures, yet others were missing and replaced with unfamiliar structures. So both, and the technology was different. We didn't have cell phones, GPS, or internet, or debit cards. So between the technology, the culture, the buildings, and the people, it felt like I was in an alternative reality that I didn't really quite belong to. I was never able to obtain gainful employment because all the employers wanted somebody who could hit the ground running, and I wasn't familiar with the technology. Some people were concerned about what the public reaction would be, or whether their employees would suddenly rebel. very hard to put things together socially. Because, I mean, I was released at 32, but I felt like I was 17, the last age I was free. So that kind of remains a problem. It's been hard putting together personal relationships. I carry a lot of baggage as far as, well, what do you do and how'd you get into that? And now my whole background is on the table. So some people are afraid. So there's part of the stigma. Yes, a few people question innocence, but that's not the case for the most part because the actual perpetrator was arrested and convicted. The real sticking point is you were in prison for 16 years wrongfully, yes, but you were there for 16 years. How much of that rubbed off on you? Is it safe to have you around? It's very awkward. It's better now, but it's still a little bit awkward when I meet with my extended family and my immediate family as well, because when there's long periods of time, I very rarely got visitors. My mother and grandmother were the only ones that came to see me consistently, but she passed while I was inside. My brother came to see me 3 times in 16 years, and not at all in the last decade. A couple of sets of aunts and uncles would come and then disappear for 3 years and repeat that, and nobody else ever came. So there's kind of a collective guilt in the family now, and it's a little awkward on my end. Also, it's been hard to communicate. I used to see a mental health professional for 4 hours a week for 6 years, just dealing with the after effects of my experience. It's common for people in my experience to have PTSD, panic attacks, anxiety, fear on seeing law enforcement, feeling of processing things at a slower rate, and a feeling of processing things at a slower rate and of being frozen in time. So I've made a lot of progress in those areas, but I cannot say that I'm completely finished with all of that. So changing gears yet again, I started my organization because I wanted to free people who are wrongfully imprisoned the same way that I was. We've gotten 7 people out in 5.5 years. We got the Commission on Prosecutorial Conduct passed, the coalition group, which I'm part of, the statewide coalition called It Can Happen to You. There's no oversight for prosecutors, so we got the law passed after 6 long years. And we remain committed to try to achieve other changes in the law. There's 2,272 documented exonerations across the country according to the National Registry of Exonerations. Common cause of wrongful conviction of prosecutorial misconduct. Coerced false confessions, which have been the cause of wrongful convictions in 25% of the cases. Videotaping the interrogation, allowing expert testimony, and having a hearing to determine the truthfulness of the confession of some of the reforms. Misidentifications, the cause of wrongful conviction in 75% of the cases. Lying informants are the cause in 15%. Bad lawyering is another factor. So a lot of us think that wrongful convictions could not happen now because we're so advanced, and that was then. But DNA is only around in 5 to 12% of all serious felony cases, and many of the systemic deficiencies are not addressed yet by legislation mandating best practices to close up those cracks in the system. And so it can happen now as easily as it did before. Thank you for listening to me. Question?
Did the state have any recompense for your, those years that you missed? Are you able to collect anything, which is really you should be collecting for all of those years that were wasted of your life? And I'm just wondering if there was any way for you to get that money that should be given to you for all the time you spent in prison.
Yes, New York State has a compensation statute on the books, so I was able to be compensated that way. And I also brought a federal civil rights lawsuit, which I was able to prevail in, so I was financially compensated. It took me 5 years before I got anything. The average length of waiting is 3 to 7 years. There is no help for exonerees when they're released. They're just released without anything. They're prisoner reentry organizations, but that's for people on parole and probation. They won't assist exonerees, and they're overrun anyway. There's 23 states across the country where there is no compensation.
What's the name of your organization? How is it funded, and exactly what does it do?
Sure. The name of the organization is named after me. I'll leave a card. You can take pictures of it. It's named after me. It's called the Jeffrey Deskovic Foundation for Justice. And it was intended to be a legacy that survives me. And the purpose of the organization is to free wrongfully convicted people and to help bring about policy changes designed to prevent what happened to me from occurring. One of our tactics in that it's not just the legislative aspect or meeting with the elected officials, a lot of it also, the spade work, means raising public awareness. So that's what we do. In terms of how it's funded, I committed some money from the compensation that I got. I put $1.5 million in to do that, to start that. But we, our fundraising didn't go well, and I had to get rid of all the employees, and I had to convert it to a volunteer entity. But my dream is to again have a full-time staff, because we have like 20 volunteers, and there's about 4 lawyers who, when we screen cases and on innocence and also on the viability, like how to win, that a case could be won, we pitch the cases to those lawyers, and sometimes they take the cases and they carry out what we can't do, what we've outlined. But that's not really a good way of operating. I do it because it's the best I can do at the moment. But what happens is, what should really take place in 6 months winds up taking place in 2.5 years. And I know what it's like to be on the other side of that, waiting. There is a crowdfunding site online called Patreon, which is for people who want to make consistent recurring donation. My crazy dream is to have 25,000 people who can afford $3 a month on a recurring basis. I have that all priced out. That would allow us to hire 2 lawyers, 3 paralegals, 3 investigators, an executive director, administrative assistant, and someone to do fundraising. So I always talk about that wherever I go, and of course I hope to find people who can contribute at that level, or maybe a little bit more, but more importantly, who can help me make the campaign go viral. You'll do a little bit, you can do a lot. So
Could you spell that?
yeah, sure, of course, I'll spell on the board. I will.
Excuse me, is
Your
your
name,
name
the
Jeffrey
organization.
or Jeffrey?
Well, it's R-E-Y. R-E-Y. Yeah, it's,
Oh,
you put Patreon on there as well, P-A-T-R-E-Y? Yeah, we'll handle that. Let's continue on with questions.
So what's the full name of this foundation?
Yes, the Jeffrey Deskovic
Yeah,
Foundation for Justice.
for justice, okay, thank you.
Yeah, it's R-E-Y, could you correct it, it's R-E-Y. Okay, let's continue on what he's doing there.
Thank you.
Okay.
When you were first incarcerated and you started this campaign to start, what kind of help did you have from within, or was it completely on your own?
No, it was on my own, because I was afraid to seek assistance from the jailhouse lawyers, because I would have to tell them what I was incarcerated for to do that. And I didn't want them to know that I was there for a rape with a murder. And one person suggested to me, look, you should go to the law library and learn the law so you can fight your case. So, but other than that, it was on my own from within. The state did provide me with a lawyer for the state appeals. For the federal appeal, some people entered the picture that I didn't know before, and they contributed something, and I got a paid lawyer for one of the proceedings. But then, when I lost, like I did, they left because we didn't have any more money. A different lawyer got herself assigned to me that had exonerated somebody else in a DNA case. So, but after that, when my representation was over, then they left as well, and so I was totally on my own for 4 years at that point. That's why I wrote all the letters.
Can you talk a little bit about your case? I'm interested in the district attorney who was in charge and the judge who sat on the bench.
The district attorney who was in charge was Carl Vagari. The prosecutor who prosecuted me in the courtroom was George Bolin.
Thought so.
The judge was Judge Nicholas Colabella.
And were you able to finish your education?
I was. When I was released, Mercy College gave me a scholarship to finish the last 30 credits, so I got the bachelor's degree that way. And I graduated in 2013 with a master's degree from John Jay College. And I have this semester and one more to graduate Pace Law School.
efforts. I mean, yours is one of them, I'm sure there are others, there's one, Deschwitz has his own thing, but it seems because there are so many different small units, is there any way to bring them together, have coordination, so they'll be much more powerful in terms of the ability to search, to do the investigation and all the rest of it? Is there anything on a national level to bring that together, instead of having individuals like yourself, which are effective, but takes a long time, it takes money, et cetera, et cetera?
Yeah, so I gotta just be descriptive rather than give you a nice neat answer in a bow, okay? There is what's called the Innocence Network Conference, and in the Innocence Network, all the organizations in the field, we get together once a year for a couple of days. We talk about the latest and greatest in the field, and there's workshops. But other than submitting, like what they call a friend of the court brief, they don't work together on individual cases. In terms of, we do work together on legislation, like the cases that, organizations that are, like the Innocence Project is in New York, the Exoneration Initiative is in New York, so we work with them on a policy level. But in terms of individual cases, the challenge with what you're asking about in terms of implementing is, number one, like the Innocence Project, they only do DNA cases, and we do DNA and non-DNA cases, of course. In fact, the exonerations we've achieved have not involved DNA, so they're not willing to expand past that. So that's one challenge with that. I've talked to them a number of times, and they're not willing to do that. The other issue is this, is that even if we came together, all their financial resources are already committed in the personnel that they have, in the cases they've already agreed to, and everybody has a mile-long waiting list. So even if we came together, that would not improve we wouldn't suddenly have greater case capacity. So that's the issue with that. Here I saw a question somewhere. Was it you?
I have followed that case very intensely because I live in Kingston.
Oh,
Yeah.
okay.
Repeat your question.
Well, it was a statement, it wasn't really a question. She commented that she lives in Peekskill, and she had followed my case. I still go back there sometimes.
You mentioned a lot of changes in laws, but are they just for New York State? What about the rest of the country?
Yeah, to effectuate change nationally, there's really two tracks. There's the federal justice system, so you would have to get laws passed in Congress. The challenge is the way that we did this in New York. We got bill sponsors, and we formed a statewide coalition, and we got municipalities to pass resolutions. We got memos of support. We got together lots of groups to give us memos of support, and we formed a coalition. So kind of a variation of what you asked me. How would that? It would be a lot to do that nationally. It could be done, but I would need to have 2 or 3 people whose job it was to do that, and to fly and there, to travel, and so that would be a different pocket of funding for that. It could be done, but that's another challenge. So that's one aspect, and that would only be true as to the federal justice system, not the state-by-state justice system. Now, they could theoretically pass legislation that tied the states to, if they wanted to get funding from the government, and they had to, do certain things. I mean, that could be a way to do it, but most of the time they don't pass bills that way. So other than that, you would need to have bills in each individual state to be passed. There's other organizations in other states, and what we're trying to do now, the coalition group, we're trying to encourage other people in other states to mimic the model that we did, to try to get the commission passed and other changes in law. We've had a little bit of interest, but at this point it's still just in the conversational piece. Nobody is doing anything. I think that most of the organizations across the country, even above and beyond people interested in innocence, even just in criminal justice reform, they're still stuck in the era of the go-it-alone approach. And I don't believe that is effective. I mean, before the coalition group was, I've been home for 12 years, and before the coalition group was put together, we did work for about 6 years, and we couldn't get anywhere. So I believe that we need to be in the coalition type mode, but not everybody's open to that, so we're trying to bring people around. Jerry?
When you were in prison, or since, is there any oversight in the prison, for example, on health conditions, on food, on violence, and various other things?
Well,
Is there any help?
no, in name, there's oversight, no, the short answer is no. In name, there's oversight groups, but, you know, they've always been oversight groups, and they look the other way, and they, you know, they're not effective, they don't do anything. When they make a visit to the prison, the administration knows that they're coming, and so they have, you know, word comes down from the top, you know, get everything spick and, you know, do the dog and pony, you know, and so that's not effective. You're back.
Is there any kind of effort that's made for a judge or a district attorney or a prosecuting attorney to have some kind of condemnation about their actual work in a case when it turns out to be such as yours?
Yes, that
Because
was,
I never read about it.
well, there has not been, but that was why we just passed the bill. After 6 years, we just passed the bill, the governor just signed it, which creates a commission on prosecutor conduct, so an oversight board. We just now got it passed, that took 6 years. So it hasn't yet been formed in operation, and by the way, I want to share that the New York State District Attorneys Association, which fought us every step of the way, and they're going to be challenging the commission in court. They're going to try to invalidate it because they don't want any oversight. Their arguments are that there is very little prosecutorial misconduct. To the extent that there is any, they can police their own. They don't want there to be a chilling effect on doing their job, which, you know, the police aren't chilled from doing their job, neither are other forensic scientists, and they could actually be sued. Forget a commission, they could actually be sued. They just do their job the right way, and then don't worry about it. But that's their argument, and another argument is, well, we want our prosecutors to focus on prosecuting criminals, not defending lawsuits. And, you know, again, don't violate anybody's rights, don't engage in unethical conduct, and you don't have to worry about that. So the commission could do public condemnation, everything from a censure up to recommendation for removal from office. So I'm hopeful about that. There is the Commission on Judicial Conduct, you know, which has taken some action at times against judges, but not enough, not enough. So there's the question.
On behalf of myself and anyone else who's ever had a connection to the criminal justice system, give you my apologies. Unfortunately, I have to make a confession to you that I spent a fair number of years lecturing law enforcement on the law of confessions, and everything you say resonates very deeply with me. I hope none of the people who questioned you were in my classes, but they might have been. I would love to exchange information with you so I can perhaps move forward on the right side of justice.
I would love to do that. We'll exchange cards, and just to share with the class as well, which dovetails into your comment. I'm certified in New Jersey as a police instructor. I'm not an officer myself, but I have the certification which allows me to lecture in the police academy. So twice a year, I'm brought in to do the noble cause corruption training. So and also best practices. So I give them my story so they can see example of one person, and then I explain what the consequences and fallout was to the officers, to the department, to the municipality, and then I share best practices designed to prevent the police from arresting the wrong person. I mean, they can voluntarily adhere to using, say, to videotaping or to using best practices for lineups. I often tell them, and it's true, I think that the cops are the first line of defense in preventing a wrongful conviction, because if they don't arrest the wrong person, the train never pulls out of the station. So I would like to do some more of that. Perhaps we can do something, and I really would like to be certified in New York. You know, it's great to do Jersey, but this is my home state, and I get accepted.
I'll see if I can help with that.
That would be awesome. Thank you. Okay, coming here, and then we'll come to Jerry.
What is your estimate, or maybe there is estimates out of the number of wrongfully convicted and sent to jail cases out of the total?
Okay. Yes, yeah, so the question is, what is my estimation of the total amount of wrongfully convicted people? Okay, so here's the answer, I have an opinion, but, you know, I want to give you the same information you have, and then I'm gonna give you my opinion, and you can make your own conclusion, instead of me just telling you my opinion, okay? So, when I think about all these different causes of wrongful conviction, when I think about how one rogue police officer can make an impact, so like in Brooklyn, there's the disgraced former detective Scarcella, who 13 people were exonerated that his cases he worked on. He used one eyewitness who was a drug addict. She had the knack of being in the right place at the right time. He used that same sole eyewitness in 7 different cases. 13 people were exonerated. There's, depending on what newspaper account you read, there's 50, 70, 90 cases of his alone that are being reviewed. So he's not the only one. So when you think about how one rogue person and then hundreds of thousands of cases have been reversed in Pennsylvania, where one rogue forensic scientist was doing what's called dry labbing, which is kind of a sarcastic term. If you remember back to science class, you put some water and you make a wet mount and throw evidence under a microscope. Well, dry labbing is, you skip the water. In other words, there is no testing going on, just giving prosecutorial-oriented results. So, there's been more than 100. In fact, one woman, Amy Duquesne, went to jail for that. Hundreds of cases were, actually, it was a couple thousand cases were overturned. You look at Chicago, where they had 2 different mass exoneration days, 15 people were exonerated in one day. Well, there's a couple of detectives, who were torturing confessions out of people. That happened on 2 different days, 15 and 15. So just example of how one rogue person. When I think about things that have passed for evidence in courtroom that has a quasi-scientific air about it, I think about things like bite mark evidence, which is not scientific, footprints, which is not scientific, fingerprints where there's not quite on the same level, but there isn't really a consensus as to how many points of match there have to be to constitute a match. My favorite, which is dog scent testimony, which would be laughable, except that people have been convicted based on it, where the dog is given an item from the crime scene and the smell, and then an item from a suspect is given, and if the dog barks after that, the dog recognized the smell. Bullet lead analysis, where there's a pretension, where it came out in newspapers where for 20 years the FBI knew that there was no scientific validity to that, but they sent experts into courtroom anyway, where they pretended, well, we can test the chemical composition of the bullets and determine where the bullets were made out of, allowing us to then trace it to the store, and you bought the bullets there. So there's that. When I think about all these different factors, when I think about now the number's up. It's 14 people that I personally did time with who were exonerated either before me or after me. I think about the iceberg effect, like what we see above the surface is just a fraction of the whole that's really going on. There's a Ohio State University study that estimates that 10,000 people are wrongfully convicted each year. So when I put it all together, and you can never count, you can only count what's known, okay? So that being said, my estimation, my educated guess, I think that the number is 15 to 20%. That's my estimation. You know everything that went into it, maybe you analyze that different, have a different opinion. There's no way to know, but that's what I think.
15 to 20% of what?
Of the inmate population, 2.3 million people who are wrongfully imprisoned. Yeah, but again, you know the factors that I based that on. Maybe it's 5%,
Convicted of
1%.
what though?
Well, different crimes, the whole
Different
range,
crimes,
everything, overall. Yeah, okay.
I read those.
Jerry will come next.
When you were interrogated,
Yes,
you said that there was no camera.
right.
At that time, it wasn't legal then?
It was not mandated that they
It was
record.
not mandated, but since then,
Since then, it's mandated in certain cases. So there's an exception for second-degree murder. They don't have to record. Different sex offenses, they don't have to record. And in certain drug offenses, they don't have to record. So it's still only a half measure. So it's not really, I don't consider it to be that effective.
what's the thinking of not recording?
Alright, so there's pushback from law enforcement and prosecutors, so the pushback is, so there's the following arguments, I'll tell you the arguments and I'll tell you why I don't consider them to be valid. So one argument is the financial argument, well, to buy this recording equipment, but look, if you save, the compensation that's paid out, if you stop one case, then that would, you pay for it itself and then some, but more importantly, a life is more than what the money is. And really, I don't think it would be that expensive, especially if you were to do like a large wholesale purchase. Another pushback argument is, well, the public is not gonna understand the interrogation tactics that we utilize, we're dealing with criminals and, they're not gonna, but I give the public more credit than that, so those are the, but then, people aren't gonna want to speak to us if they know the camera is on, but you can tape surreptitiously. So that's my answer for that, and, the equipment may malfunction. So, well, look, a malfunction is not a reason not, on a seatbelt may malfunction. Well, I don't think that's a reason to not have that law, to mandating it, and it does help. Now, I think that, requiring something to be 100% effective in all instances is not a realistic standard. I think if it helps just sometimes, then it's worth doing. So that's the police pushback, and the prosecutors agree with those positions, but they add, we agree with those things, but we do want there to be videotaping anyway, but we just don't want it to be mandatory. Those will be challenges, we want it done anyway, but it should be voluntary. We don't want it mandatory. And, I don't like the idea of leaving it up to discretion, because it's not gonna be done at times. And the other thing is that I think that if it's not done, then I think that I don't think that the interrogation should be admissible as evidence if they purposely don't do it, and that's not with the law that's passed, even if it was in one of those cases where it's mandated. The impact is that the judge could not allow it, but he could allow it anyway, and you could just get a jury instruction to be skeptical of it because they didn't follow the law, but I think it shouldn't be allowed in.
Yeah, I just read within the last 2 weeks about a study of DNA evidence, and it indicated that there was not foolproof proof that DNA is totally valid.
Right, so DNA validity is dependent upon the lab following the correct protocols and no contamination happening. So that's part of it. And the other thing is that items have to be related to something. So baseball cap upstairs in an attic, I don't think is really that relevant to what happens in the garage. So those are the two. That's the area in that. So it really depends upon, and there's been exonerations in cases that originally happened because of erroneous DNA test results. But so again, it depends upon if the protocols are followed, if there's no contamination. I want to just go back to you again. I think you raised it just because I think it ties into the videotaping thing possibly. So then we'll come back to that.
As far as I recall,
Yes.
the New York City Police Department, which is of course by far the largest police department in the country and probably the world, was the most resistant to the videotaping. Where does that sit right now? Are they doing the videotaping in NYPD now or no?
They're only doing it, no, the short answer is they're only doing it in, for the most part, they're only doing it in the cases that are mandated to do it. They're not, that's what they're doing it mainly, they're still not doing it totally.
It's kind of scary to think that where we live, New York State, we always think we're in a bubble, that we are better than everybody else, and I just finished reading, and I cannot think of the name of it, a memoir by a black lawyer.
Mercy.
July Mercy?
What, Just Mercy?
Just Mercy.
Just Mercy,
Yeah.
sure,
That was
Brian
really-
Stevenson,
Yes.
Oh my God, it
yes.
was just so
Yeah,
phenomenal,
I know
it was
Brian,
better
it's
than
great.
a novel.
yes.
But he talks about how all of this injustice is going on in the South, and people are put immediately on death row. I mean, it's even scarier than your story.
Sure, of course.
But I think he also alludes to the fact that justice depends on how much money you have.
Sure.
Yes.
Yeah, it's sure.
So, your estimation of how many wrongful accusations there are may not be true of what's in the South, it may be
Right.
far higher.
True.
And,
Could be.
and certainly based on monetary affluence,
Yeah, of course, plus there's also the racial aspect to it also.
much higher, much higher.
Yeah, in the South, a lot of the, yeah, so.
What consequences did the municipalities and those policemen face? Any at all?
Sure. All right, so the book, just to clarify real quick, then we'll come to your question back. The book is called Just Mercy. I would recommend it.
It's wonderful.
In fact, you can go to YouTube and put in Brian Stevenson, and there's lectures of him doing YouTube. There's his TED Talk where he brought the house down. I've seen Brian speak 3 times in person. We're friendly with each other. He's awesome. So I would recommend reading the book and looking at his videos. But your question now is remind me of the question. Now I managed to forget. Go ahead.
What kind of consequences
Yes.
did the municipalities and the police face?
Okay, so I did bring civil suit in federal court, the civil rights lawsuit. So the police themselves didn't pay anything. The municipality paid for their defense as far as lawyers, and they paid the judgment also. They didn't have to pay a dime. That being said, it is public record, so I'll share with you. So Peekskill had to pay $5.3 million they had to pay. And by the way, that's what they paid, it's not what I got. Just everyone should understand the difference. You have to, so the way that it works, the lawyers take, the civil rights lawyers, they take a case that's called on contingency, meaning you don't pay out of pocket. Because, I wouldn't be able to bring a suit otherwise, and most people would not. But in exchange, and if they lose, that means they're not gonna get anything. But in exchange for taking that risk, they take a third. And you have to pay the legal expenses. That the third is their profit. The expenses, so all the depositions, the experts, the postage, down to the thumbtack, it's all billed to you. And so in reality, you, as a litigant, you really get 55 to 60% of what you're awarded. So that's from.
Did anybody get fired or?
Nobody got fired. In fact, the lieutenant from Peekskill who oversaw everything, he was actually promoted to police chief in part based on my case. And when I was exonerated, even after I was exonerated, so the paper that I was a weekly columnist for the Westchester Guardian, which was a good thing. I made like $1,000 a month, and that was all I could really make. I made some money doing presentations, but you get booked, you get paid. And I was never able to get gainful employment. So anyway, coming to the point, that newspaper, they called for his firing by the Peekskill mayor. They had him in uniform on the cover and the whole thing. The municipality stayed with him as the police chief for another 6 to 7 years after that. So nobody was ever fired. The 2 detectives, they retired, they got their pension. One of them was teaching a crime scene investigation class in an upstate college. Now, what did happen was that so 2 weeks before I emerged, the prosecutor, George Boland, he suddenly retired and ran to Florida. So I think he was tipped off, because they didn't let me out as soon as they got the result back. They ran a lot of confirmatory tests. So I think that they told him, look, get the hell out of here, okay, please. So he retired because of that. The medical examiner, when I brought, because I had 4 defendants in the federal suit. It was Peekskill, it was Putnam County because it was their polygraphist. It was the medical examiner in Westchester because it was his fraud. And then also legal aid because of their deficient representation. So I had 4 defendants in the lawsuit. So when I filed suit against the Westchester County, the medical examiner suddenly retired. So that was his fallout. But again, nothing happened to him. He could theoretically start doing autopsies again, whenever he chose to get back into the business.
Legal aid?
Legal aid represented.
Legal aid. I sued legal aid of Westchester.
Why?
because they provided me with deficient representation. They did not interview my alibi, they didn't explain the DNA evidence, they didn't use that to argue the confession was coerced, and the conflict of interest. You know, they settled with me because the public defender, there was a note that he put into the legal aid, to the file, memorializing that I told him where I was when the crime happened. I told him I was playing wiffle ball, here's who I was playing with, this is the address.
Fantastic.
He had a note in that file memorializing that, which he forgot about. And it was also clear that he never spoke to that alibi, he never sent an investigator out either. And so based upon that, they had to settle with me. That was deficient legal representation, that was legal malpractice. Jerry didn't look in here.
In your investigations where you freed some people, did anyone go to jail or lose their jobs? Do you
No.
know?
No,
No.
no, nothing like the job. That's typical.
I'm thinking about how you can have greater outreach and be more effective in terms of fundraising and reach more people.
Sure.
You talked about Ryan Stevenson's book. I mean, he's reached, is that the best avenue for you to take? Would you consider writing a book or maybe joining forces with someone like him? I mean, I'm
Yeah, I
thinking
understand, yeah,
bigger.
you're brainstorming with me, yeah. So here's the answer, let me answer the book and then I'll get to your bigger question. So I have a book written, it's 95% written. There's a lot of exonerate books out there that never went anywhere, never made a difference, that aren't read. And the reason is they run to a small press or they self-publish. Okay, so I have one story and I wanted to reach people and make a difference. That only happens if people read it. So I used to have a literary agent and he sent a sample chapter and an overview to all the major publishing companies. And he had a long list of successful clients, so I know he knows what he's doing. Everybody loved the story, they were moved by the writing. At the same time, they said that their prior endeavors into that genre of type of book didn't do well commercially, and so they didn't think it was the right fit. And so rather than publish nowhere at all, I'd rather wait for my star to keep going up to get a new opportunity. So that's in terms of the book. And that holds me back in a number of ways. The additional credibility, but also the idea of having a movie or having a documentary, those things normally, and even having a speakers bureau represent you, that normally flows having a book in print. And I've tried to do it without that anyway, with that obstacle, and I got nowhere. But the bigger question is, so I've spoken with the head of the fundraising department at the Innocence Project, because they have like a $12 to $14 million annual budget. And I've spoke with them a number of times, and she said to me that she would not be able to raise money if it was not for the board members that she has. With they're writing a check and they're introducing her to people in their network that the cause would most speak to. So my problem is that, you know, I'm only in the position that I'm here in my position kind of artificially, because I was wrongfully imprisoned and I was able to sue and I won. I didn't arrive here because I made it in business 10, 20, 30, 40 years, and now I have cachet with my colleagues who came up the ranks also. So my challenge is I need to find people who this cause speaks to, who will help, who will join the board, right, doing what all healthy board members, what all board members do in healthy organizations. They give or get, which means you're responsible to bring in a certain amount of money every year, no matter what. And then in addition to that, they can connect to other people that the cause speaks to, kind of like what the Innocence Project does. So I haven't been able to find, you know, board members like that. I just added one person, but it's just one person. You know, I need to add some other people. So if that were to happen, then I think that I would get bigger. The other thing, which kind of ties into that, but just a separate branch. So I would like to have a post-conviction clinic at the law school, which works with my organization kind of like how Cardozo Law School works with the Innocence Project. And then standing next to me with the moral credibility of the law school, I believe I could raise more money than if be successful. So here's where I'm at on that. So the school is very, very interested. They want to do it. In fact, there's a meeting later on this morning that's happening with my connection at the school and the other relevant personnel. The problem is that the people who are going to fund it, right, and to start out, it was like about 400, if we put the budget together, it would be a pair of lawyers, an investigator, an executive director. You need that in order to be able to raise more money to add the other components. So after talking with people for about a year, these donors, they kind of threw me a curve at the end with decision-making time. So they said to me, well, we'll give you half the money. We'll give you $200,000 a year for 4 years, commitment minimum, right? Because the school won't do it if they don't know the school is going to be a 4-year runway to sustain it. But the catch is, you got to find the other half. I haven't been able to find the other half, so that's kind of been that's really has been the challenge. So that's where we're at that. So look, I mean, if there's people who know people who might be willing to serve on a board, certainly recommendations, would be most appreciated. Another aspect of the problem has been when I've talked with people when I've met with other people of means, a lot of them already are on boards already. I need 2 or 3 boards, and I don't need that. I need somebody who is not on other boards. Maybe it's like one other board at most, because even with those people, they reach a point where the people in their network get tapped out or they're tired. So I need somebody new. And the question becomes, well, you want to help Jeff with the amazing story with some results, but a much more modest operation, or do you want to help the 700-pound gorilla that has $12 to $14 million budget that has 150 wins? So what's the better bang for your buck? So that becomes the challenge. My answer is, well, we do non-DNA in addition to DNA. We have some results, and if all you're ever going to do is just fund the places that are established, well, then you're never going to have any new blood. You're never going to grow this beyond that. I think that those are all good arguments. I mean, we're the only entity that is started by somebody coming from my position, that has the exonerated component. I think that those are all great arguments. I've been the only one who thinks that those are great arguments. So. I can do questions on the side, I think our official time.